You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Good to be back with you, Prashant. How are you doing this week?
Good. How you doing?
Doing well. We are finally going to talk about the 2019 novel coronavirus outbreak, which began in Wuhan, China. This has obviously been something that I think many of our listeners have been expecting us to tackle. The reason we didn't get to it before this week is because there was a lot of uncertainty about what exactly this outbreak would mean for the Asia Pacific region and the world more broadly. But now, several weeks in, the first cases that were reported were in early January, and now we're in the first week of February. I should clarify that we're recording this on February 5th, U.S. Eastern Time at around 3 p.m., and the only reason I make that clear is things are changing very quickly, including the number of infections in China and the overall death toll. So one of the things that's really, I think, striking about the coronavirus is the extent to which this epidemic has so quickly spread around the world, and particularly inside China. So as of February 5th in the morning here in the United States, the number of reported cases in China was inching up towards 25,000. And another 27 countries around the world, many of them in Asia, were exhibiting several cases. And we had records of 2 deaths outside of China from the disease, both from people that had been to Wuhan, China recently. One of those deaths was in the Philippines and a second in Hong Kong. So, Prashant, there's a lot to talk about here, and I think we'll try to cover the gamut as best we can. One of the big things, I think, is the domestic reaction within China. A lot of comparisons have been made with what the Chinese government learned and did not learn from the SARS epidemic in the early 2000s, in 2002, 2003, and sort of the role of authoritarian controls on the spread of information and how the Chinese government has dealt with that since. There's a lot of skepticism internationally about whether the Chinese government, despite having been quite transparent about the actual nature of the coronavirus itself, sharing the genetic buildup of the virus itself, whether the Chinese government has been forthcoming about the extent of the problem domestically. And then secondly, we can talk a little bit about the regional reaction and the global reaction, how countries have reacted to the spread of this disease and the measures that are being taken across Asia to halt its spread more broadly. And that, I think, leads to some interesting second-level issues in terms of the blowback against Asians worldwide. We've had some distressing stories, I think, from Europe and even in other places in Asia where anybody that appears to be Chinese is treated poorly. We've seen a spike in racism and xenophobia against people of East Asian descent more broadly. And it'll be, I think, worth discussing if that's going to lead to a broader blowback within China, depending on how long this runs for. But there's a lot of uncertainty about the coronavirus still. How long is this epidemic going to run for? Is this going to become a pandemic, which is an epidemic occurring on multiple continents? Right now, this is an epidemic in Asia, but still not an epidemic outside of Asia just yet. There are concerns about how long this will go on. The Japanese government in particular has reason to be concerned, given that it is hosting the Summer Olympic Games later this year, and if the coronavirus epidemic does continue, that might require significant changes to the Olympics, potentially even including a delay or a cancellation. But let's begin by talking a little bit about the domestic reaction in China. What have you taken away from the way the Chinese government has dealt with this internally and externally?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the more fascinating angles in terms of how this is playing out because the big comparison that's been made with respect to the coronavirus has been, the response relative to the SARS crisis that emerged in the 2000s. And I think, that might be useful in some ways in terms of comparing it to a previous case that, is analogous in some way. But I think in many ways it kind of misses the point, right? So where China is in now and where it was in the 2000s is significantly different, right? In the 2000s, we were dealing with a China that was, still rising. Economic linkages with a lot of the surrounding Asian countries were not as deep. They were deepening, but not as deep. And I think we were also in an environment where we were still in this sort of, post-Cold War phase of, an environment where we assumed, democracy was still rising, a little bit of a slowdown, but not nearly the kind of conversation we're having today. Whereas in the contrast now, I mean, this epidemic is happening when we have a conversation about, a risen China, much more, stronger economic linkages, and a period where, democracies are feeling a sense of rollback amid, sort of challenges from authoritarian countries and regimes like China and Russia. And so when you have a story and a development like this break, there will be even more scrutiny on China's domestic governance. And I think part of it has to do with how China's responding, but part of it has to do with that broader environment. And it's very difficult to actually evaluate some of these claims, right? So, there is evidence, and we've seen reports about this, that there were, cases of human transmission that were evident earlier, and yet the news didn't break until, a few days or a few weeks later, which, in a crisis like this, you do want to see some, quick response. So that obviously is something that we can actually think about as a more specific manifestation of it. But some of the other criticisms in terms of how China is managing this is very difficult to know. Even conversations that I've heard from health experts that have been talking about this, including those that are familiar with the environment in China, they have been saying, well, the environment and the system in China makes it very difficult to evaluate this because you have the response of the national government versus the responses of the local authorities. In some cases, China has acted very quickly to sort of quarantine places and make sure that things have cleaned up. But in some cases, they've done that too efficiently. And so there's no evidence to actually report. And they've actually not coordinated as well with international authorities. And so it's very difficult in this sort of non-transparent environment to get a sense of how China's responding. But I think it's fair to say that we have enough evidence that there's been some sort of issues with how China's responding to this at the domestic level, and that matters because it affects inherently what happens internationally as well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we should talk a little bit about the measures that China's taken. So right before the Lunar New Year holiday, China announced that the city of Wuhan, a city of around 11 million people in central China, a major transportation hub, right before the Lunar New Year holiday would be entirely shut down, and effectively the entire city remains under quarantine. Hubei province in central China is really the epicenter of the outbreak. Wuhan specifically, other cities in the region have also been cracked down, and that's sort of one of the measures that really China, with its authoritarian system, is able to take steps like that. Since those steps, the World Health Organization has actually been quite complimentary towards China on the extent of cooperation, despite having declared this an international emergency after an initial meeting. But I mean, it really seems like even within the crisis, Chinese leaders are not necessarily learning the lessons of either the SARS crisis or the effects that information controls have already had on controlling the coronavirus outbreak. Just 2 days ago, the Politburo Standing Committee in China, the apex political organization within the Communist Party, met to discuss the issue and called for actually strengthening internet and media controls to prevent the spread of sort of panic and what they claim was misinformation. So really, this is, I think, a major test for the Chinese political system. And, I mean, we have to also acknowledge that this is coming at a if you look at the last year in China, I mean, I think for Xi Jinping in particular, there have been a lot of sources of concern for the longer term sustainability of the Chinese model. I mean, not only can we talk about, slowing growth rates even before the coronavirus shock to the Chinese economy, but obviously protests in Hong Kong, the election result in Taiwan with a resounding mandate for Tsai Ing-wen and the independence-leaning Democratic Progressive Party, increased scrutiny of China's actions in Xinjiang. All of this, I think, on top of this, now you get this coronavirus outbreak, and you have been seeing examples of Chinese citizens actually, questioning as much as they can before these posts get deleted on Weibo and other Chinese social media outlets about the way in which this is being handled. So longer term, I mean, if this epidemic does persist for weeks and months, that could lead to a serious bout of political instability within China. And I think the Communist Party is quite worried about that internally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we are seeing, growing evidence of, cases within China where either information restrictions or issues about how people will actually be dealt with are emerging, right? So in Xinjiang, for example, I think the latest we've heard from the Chinese government is they can't discuss the conditions of, citizens in that area, particularly those in camps, because, that's a state secret in China. But, nonetheless, when these situations arise, you do have questions not just about, the people who are free in China, but also the people who are under duress. And the fact that we see that situation emerging doesn't bode well for China's international reputation within this broader environment we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, so we should talk a little bit about the economic implications. So the minute this it became apparent that this was an international emergency and an epidemic, the number one concern I think a lot of people had was what will the effect be on supply chains connected to China, and including the cessation of the outflow of tourism, but also given the panic over coronavirus right now. Consumption in China is simply down. People aren't leaving the house. They're not spending money like they would be. But again, longer term, I think there are serious concerns. What's been interesting though is that if you look at if you look at the stock market for companies with significant exposures to China, let's like take a company like Apple. There hasn't really been a major correction just yet over this panic. So it seems like investors are still hedging that this is not going to get as bad as some of the dire predictions have suggested. But certainly, I think if you look at the Chinese Communist Party's concerns about growth more broadly, this is really a crisis that stands to make that matter a lot worse. So I think that's something to definitely keep an eye on. But a lot of international airlines are shutting down operations to China, which is also going to prevent people-to-people contacts between China and the outside world. In the United States right now, non-American citizens or permanent residents that have been to Hubei province recently are not being let into the United States, which is a pretty dramatic course of action that China has actually criticized. And maybe that's actually a segue to talk a little bit about some of the blowback that we're seeing, especially, the nationalist Global Times on Twitter and in a number of articles has been critical of the United States and saying that the U.S. is not actually helping China deal with the coronavirus. And of course, there are conspiracy theories upon conspiracy theories that, depending on who you talk to, that this is some kind of U.S. Designed conspiracy or, if in other parts of the world, there's conspiracies that this is a bioweapon. In case any listeners are sort of mulling these conspiracies, I mean, that's really not how a bioweapon would work. You don't want high communicability and low lethality like the coronavirus exhibits. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. So what have you made of the blowback that we've kind of seen within China towards the way in which the U.S. and some other countries have reacted so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're right to sort of, caution that this is something that, plays out in a lot of these crises that we heard. I remember during the bird flu or the avian flu crisis too, we heard some similar conspiracy theories that were emerging. So not necessarily surprising on that front. I think, going back to the sort of regional and international context that you laid out there, we are in an environment of, increased, U.S.-China competition on a variety of fronts. And I think the hope would be that in a normal situation where you have both sides talking to each other, that this is the kind of crisis that would bring both governments together and really bring the world together to tackle this. Because, these pandemics and diseases don't really see through borders or geopolitical tensions or divisions, right? But instead, I think what's playing out is, you're seeing elements of this on both sides, conspiracy theories emerging out of China, but also, a very much a lot of scrutiny on each comment that, any U.S. official makes. I think when Pompeo was in Central Asia, when he suggested, plainly that, the coronavirus was emerging from China, there was a scrutiny on that saying, oh, he went out of his way to point out that the coronavirus is happening and he's viewing this from a very geopolitical lens. So I think there's a tendency for both sides, to sort of play on, the worst instincts that they see in each other. But one would hope that, given the fact that we have this sort of shared threat or challenge, that, that sort of broader sensibility will prevail.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the sort of panicked response in a lot of places that's really manifested in xenophobia and racism against folks of East Asian descent. I mean, this has been a major problem, especially in Europe, actually. There's been some really distressing reporting from places like Italy, which is the largest destination for Chinese overseas tourists annually, where people have been, the site of a person of East Asian descent wearing a mask in an airport causes panic for people. I mean, this kind of, I think this is actually a very serious phenomenon in the sense that this is obviously generating a high degree of resentment, not only in China, but even outside of China, because obviously you don't have to be Chinese to face that kind of discrimination overseas during a panicked crisis like this. But how do you see this playing out? I mean, over the long term, I mean, even in places like Southeast Asia and South Asia, there has been concern of this sort manifesting in this very kind of xenophobic behavior. A longer term, I can definitely see that blowing back with a broader resentment within China against many of these places, especially.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a particularly concerning aspect of all this, right? So, you're seeing, as you said, in Southeast Asia, cases already emerging of, restaurants, tourism sites saying, no entry if you're Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Not very useful thing, but also very difficult for governments to control because you get down to sort of how the private sector, individual businesses and entities are responding. But nonetheless very troubling because of the sort of racial stereotypes. And you're also seeing the sort of, the broader cultural stereotypes about, who's wearing masks and, why Asians do this or, why Asians don't do that. Issues of, hygiene and sort of, the idea that you shouldn't mix around with Asian people. In contrast to the fact that, as we pointed out, there's still a lot that we don't know. This is still something which, relative to SARS and some of the other things we've said, it's quite serious. But we're literally getting new facts every day, including on, who's infected and who's not. And if you look actually at the advice that's been given by medical professionals, including the Center for Disease Control, the folks who really know this stuff, in terms of precautions, I mean, they're saying a lot of the things that, appear very sensible rather than, things that would cause people to panic. So they're saying things like, watch where you travel if you're going to Asia, certain places that are vulnerable, but also, basic sensible advice, to avoid things like the common cold, make sure you wash your hands, preserve basic hygiene and things like that. So I think, in a situation, in a crisis like this, the hope is always that you get, cooler heads prevail and there's not a sense of panic. But unfortunately, you're seeing a lot of this manifest in some very ugly ways across the region, which is, not very hopeful.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting reactions I think among many governments is that in some places, the policy advice that is being given by national governments to the coronavirus situation in China is sort of being taken as a vote of confidence in the Chinese government's ability to manage this crisis internally and externally, right? So what's been really fascinating is the reaction of a country like Cambodia, right? A major Chinese partner. Prime Minister Hun Sen has certainly, I think, carved himself a space out in Asia as a leader who is very much throwing in his lot with the Chinese government, showing that he's fully confident that China will handle this appropriately. In fact, he just traveled to meet with Xi Jinping to actually demonstrate that in person, and he's also, sniped at journalists and press conferences for wearing masks, saying that, if he's not wearing a mask, why should reporters be wearing masks? What do you make of this? I mean, longer term. I mean, first of all, since you work on Southeast Asia, I'm just curious for your, what you make of Hun Sen and Cambodia's reaction here. But secondly, I mean, in Southeast Asia, we're seeing many of the most the highest number of infections outside of China. For example, Thailand and Singapore each have over 20 infections. Malaysia with around 10 or possibly more. So what is the regional response right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that's an evolving story, right? Like, so as you pointed out, you've had a number of Southeast Asian countries have cases. The Philippines was actually where the first, I think, confirmed deaths was reported outside of China. And so Southeast Asia really has been, at the center of all of this. And the sort of trade and economic linkages between China and Southeast Asian states, really have increased over the past few years. And this is where you see sort of the negative manifestations of this, right? In terms of, people who are traveling back and forth and such. I think the sort of governance problem with a lot of these Southeast Asian states bears out here. So I think in some of the cases, like, if cases were breaking out in countries that are less developed, you worry about capacity issues. In the case of Cambodia, though, I think, Hun Sen's, trip to China and kind of the way he's framed it is to sort of show solidarity with China in face of, when a lot of its responses are being questioned and the international community is sort of condemning China for its response, which is actually a caricaturing of what the international response has been. But I think Hun Sen has been trying to, sort of mount this, hyperbolic initiative to sort of go to China and say, hey, listen, we're not actually going to, isolate China. I'm happy to visit here, and Cambodians, shouldn't be scared about what's happening. The problem with that, though, is that, as you pointed out with the sort of press conference and his thing about, you don't need to wear a mask. The prime minister is not wearing a mask. Things like this. It falls into the category of some of the stereotypical comments that we've heard from some Asian officials, around the region about, what this virus is about and how to take preventive measures and how not to. And so it's sort of a very interesting case of, Hun Sen trying to show that Cambodia is very close to China and has solidarity, but also domestically, really raising questions about what a Southeast Asian leader is actually telling the public to do in that sense. I think it is important to emphasize, though. I mean, the other flip side of this is an example of Singapore, for example, where the government is extremely competent in handling this, and you would think of all the Asian governments that are dealing with this, the Singaporeans would be most well placed to do it. But even the Singaporean government has faced some difficulties in terms of being able to distribute the amount of masks that are available, stemming false information and disinformation. So even I think the most capable countries in Southeast Asia and the region, it's important to emphasize, face challenges during the times like this. And it's not just countries that are lesser developed or closer to China necessarily that have this issue.
Yeah, I mean, to go a little bit to another part of Asia, I think one of the major parts of Asia that I'm very concerned about reacting to the coronavirus is actually North Korea. So
Mm-hmm.
North Korea is very, very sensitive to international public health shocks. For example, they reacted to the Ebola crisis a few years ago, the country was effectively locked down as best as they could. And this time it seems that they've gone even further. The border with Russia is shut, trains and airplanes aren't coming in. The land border with China, especially, has been a major source of concern because coronavirus cases have been reported in China's northern Jilin province, which borders North Korea. But economically, I mean, one of the major sources of revenue that the North Korean state continues to rely on under the international sanctions regime is tourism. They've actually been making a lot of investments recently. Kim Jong Un himself has been visiting hot springs and ski resorts and investing in coastal resorts in places like Wonsan on the North Korean east coast. And now, depending on how long this coronavirus situation remains hot, and especially it remains hot in China, it could be a very, very serious problem for North Korea economically. It's in a way, I mean, the North Koreans are taking measures to sanction themselves, right? Because even though they are going to lose massive amounts of tourist revenue, the worst possible thing for them would be to have a coronavirus epidemic enter their borders and stress their very poor public health infrastructure, effectively requiring them to allow international assistance into the country, which is something that they're, again, not very keen on doing. But what's been interesting and what I've been wondering about is whether the coronavirus shock is actually going to prevent North Korea from potentially lashing out in other ways, right? I mean, we've been anticipating North Korea to potentially conduct ballistic missile launches or even possibly hold a military parade. Actually, some satellite imagery from January suggested that they were preparing for a parade before the coronavirus situation became apparent. And now they've issued guidance saying that no public gatherings are encouraged or permitted around the country, which suggests that they won't be doing a military parade. So I think certainly for a country like North Korea, this is a major source of concern. They are simply not ready to deal with a public health crisis like the coronavirus. And given its high level of communicability, it's completely unsurprising the extent to which that they've tried to shut down incoming travel from the Chinese side of the border. But we'll have to see. I mean, what the longer term economic implications of this will be on the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think, to your point about, other regions, and this is obviously an evolving story. We have seen in another sub-region of concern would be South Asia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen cases already in Nepal and Sri Lanka. And I sort of do wonder, how far that's going to spread out as well, because that's another one of focus and attention.
Yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, I mean, there are still lots of questions about the precise
Hmm.
extent to which this disease is communicable. It is remarkable, though. I mean, looking at the fatality figures that have been reported by China, almost 500 as of this recording, and the fatalities outside of China, there is really, I think, a sharp difference there, and the reasons for that aren't really apparent. But I guess for listeners at least, there has been a lot of panic around the coronavirus, but at least for now, it does appear that most people who are succumbing to the disease are people with already compromised immune systems or the elderly. I think the
Hmm.
youngest person to have died so far was 36 years old, which is certainly, I think, on the young side, but not anything like the 1918 Spanish flu, for example, which was particularly deadly against even healthier younger people. So yeah, I mean, this is something to keep an eye on. I think nobody really expected 2020 to kick off with a potential global pandemic on our hands. And this isn't just yet a pandemic, but certainly the communicability of this disease, and depending on the effectiveness of the global public health response, it might end up being something that we end up talking about for a long time, right? So
Hmm.
certainly, I know that that's a major concern for Japan hosting the Summer Olympics later this year. So yeah, I think Prashant will have to keep a close eye on this, and we'll probably end up talking about it sooner rather than later, I expect.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for joining me, Prashant.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Great. So, for our listeners, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or any other number of podcast providers out there. And if you have been a listener for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do that. We really appreciate that. It also helps new people find the show. So please do leave us a review. We really do appreciate those. And finally, before we close, a note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.